Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 40, Trancing Tarkovsky.
40 episodes, Jonathan, and a big name for our 40th.
Yeah, so Tarkovsky's not a new name, but he's kind of the first of the world tour directors that we're circling around and are getting their full episode. We said that many times on the world tour. This director needs their a whole episode. This director needs a whole episode. And we're finally doing it. We're doing Andrei Tarkovsky.
Yeah. It's certainly one of the most unique directors to have ever directed. Mostly because he just wanted to be unique. He had his own unique way of viewing the world, and he really brought that to his cinema and his unique brand of visual imagery. That is just fascinating. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about Tarkovsky the man before we discuss Tarkovsky the filmmaker?
Absolutely. So he was born in Russia. He's a Russian director, obviously, in 1932. And his father was actually one of Russia's most famous poets, and he was a translator, Arseny Tarkovsky. And we'll talk about him a little bit later because he comes into play in The Mirror quite a bit. And he studied film at the State Institute of Cinematography, also known as the VGIK, and graduated with the film The Steamroller and the Violin, which won first prize at the New York Student Film Festival. So even right out of school, he was getting a lot of attention. And then he picked up a film that was already in works at the Russian studio Mosfilm, Ivan's Childhood. It was kind of floundering, and so he picked it up and kind of took it on himself as a challenge to see if he could be a director, see if he was cut out for it and do a feature-length project. And he could. So he worked on several other films after that in Russia, and then after the film Stalker, which we've already talked about on the podcast, he was traveling abroad in Europe, and there were a lot of tensions between him and his studio heads in Russia, and he vowed never to work in Russia again, and he never did. He made 2 more films in Europe in exile. Sometimes people describe it as, but I'm not sure if he was technically in exile.
It was more like self-imposed exile.
Yeah. And so he made 2 more films in Europe before he died of lung cancer in Paris at the quite young age of 54. And we can debate all day whether he died from the plant in Stalker, which we talked about in that episode, or the KGB, or just, from smoking.
Yes, our first film today, like you mentioned, is Ivan's Childhood from 1962. It is based on a short story by Vladimir Bogomolov, and that was written in 1957 and just called Ivan, about a child on the Eastern Front during World War II. And what is our second film today, Jonathan?
Yeah, so next we will be looking at Solaris from 1972, based on Stanislaw Lem's novel, a Polish author called Solaris also, which was written in 1961. And we'll talk about how Lem was not very fond of the final product of the film. And it was kind of Tarkovsky's attempt to financially rebound at Mosfilm after his big epic Andrei Rublev, which I don't know if it was a hit or not. It is now, but it was a massive project that took a lot of resources.
It was also fairly quickly shut down by Russia, I believe.
And we'll talk about that a lot today, because he has lots of tensions with Russia. Yeah.
And our last film today is The Mirror from 1975, which is just... What?
It's very different, yeah. We talked about a lot of weird movies, but this one is beautifully weird.
It'll put you in a trance. This one is semi-autobiographical, and this is an idea that Tarkovsky had in the works for a very long period of time. He's had it at least since 1964. It's kind of a film he had always wanted to make. And as you can tell, he made it 10 years after he originally wanted to make it. And, you're 10 years older, 10 more years of life experience, 10 more years to add to an autobiography. So yeah, it was a very interesting final product and a very worthwhile final product to examine and learn from if you want to direct in Tarkovsky style, and at not, if even if you don't want to just enjoy.
Yeah, and the other thing we should mention is that, as we sort of talked about last week, we put this kind of back to back with Stanley Kubrick because they have a lot of similarities in their directing style and stuff like that. But I think we both realized the more we watched this week how unique Tarkovsky is to himself among directors.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about the way that Solaris is often compared to 2001. In that section of the podcast, but really Tarkovsky is quite a unique director.
Yeah. The two of them often get referred to as the mad geniuses, especially because they're kind of around the same era. One is from the U.S., one is from Russia. You know, there's a nice little parallel there. But I think if there's one thing that you and I can kind of take from our whole experience with the filmlings, it's that every director who is worthwhile is at least a little bit crazy. So
yeah,
it manifests itself into their unique directing style, and the world that created Tarkovsky specifically created a very interesting director with a very interesting outlook back on that world. And for our first in-depth look into that world, Jonathan, do you want to set up Ivan's childhood for us?
Yeah, so Ivan's childhood, which is our black and white war drama to contrast with Dr. Strangelove from last week and The Great Dictator the week before. We have lots of black and white war films. But it is the story of a child, Ivan, obviously, who is basically kind of acting as a spy for the Russian army on the Nazis. He's small and able to kind of maneuver in ways that a normal adult soldier may not be able to. But it's really about his experience. And I think Tarkovsky was trying to convey the contrast between the innocence and youthfulness of a child with the horrors of war. And this is different from other war films that we've looked at because it's not necessarily dark and gritty. It is dark, but it's also very beautiful in its own way and poetic, which we're going to talk about with all of these films. But it's interesting seeing that style brought to a war film. And so as Ivan kind of goes through his interactions with the military and the different characters, we see the way that different people interact with the war. And I don't want to spoil this one. It kind of it has a little bit of a spoiler ending, but yeah, it's really about seeing the different scenarios and the different characters trying to protect Ivan, but also trying to capitalize on his uses in the war at the same time, and his zeal for being useful to the cause at the same time, which is another interesting element, that he wants to be part of this movement and he wants to help, but the people around him are very trying to be protective of him and make sure that he's not in danger, but not fighting too hard for that because they keep using him when he's needed.
Right. And I find the character of Ivan to be just completely fascinating. In a lot of ways, I think a lot of Tarkovsky's films, in a way at least, become a character study, just because he deals with the psyche, memory, dreams, diving into characters' minds. And, you know, in this film, Ivan really gets dissected and taken apart and I don't want to say analyzed because that doesn't feel very Tarkovsky-esque, but broken down. Yeah. And I mean, this
in many ways,
this is a very complicated kid. He's young, but he clearly has PTSD. His family has definitely been killed or taken, probably killed. I think almost definitely
they've been killed.
Yeah. Like if the flashbacks, memories, they're not really flashbacks. They're dreams / memories.
Definitely his mom and sister were killed. I think they say that in the film.
Yeah. And I think the most interesting part about Ivan is his his determination to be part of the war, even when everybody around him is trying to send him to military school and like, you can kill Nazis when you get older, kid.
Nazis.
You've done your part. Go be safe. We want you to be safe. You don't need to do this. But he just keeps throwing himself back in, with this remarkable determination. But I also feel like he's I think he feels like running away from the pain of his past by running into war and by staying busy and staying stressed and putting himself on that front line with the enemies and running away from his childhood and trying to be an adult as much as he can.
Yeah,
even
and
when
he
he's
does
not.
feel very old.
Yeah, especially when so many of the characters around him are vying for the respect of another authority figure. For instance, the first officer he runs into in the film, who doesn't know him initially, is a lieutenant who's a fairly young lieutenant, and over the course of the film, several times works for the respect and makes efforts to gain the respect of the older officers around him. He's still trying to prove he's an adult, even though he's technically an adult and he's a lieutenant, he's an officer. Which is a very interesting parallel within the film to see that comparison.
And then at the same time, we see the flaws of the older lieutenants and the ways in which that younger lieutenant is in some ways more mature, specifically in the interactions with this doctor's assistant, who is in a very kind of nuanced way. I don't want to say preyed upon or assaulted, because that feels reductionistic, in the way that this is presented. But he definitely makes advances. One of the older officers makes advances towards her, and when the younger lieutenant, whose command she is in, kind of suspects this, he transfers her in order to get her out of that situation, even though she's very good at what she does. And so we're seeing that dynamic. There's lots of dynamics that don't even involve Yvonne, but he's kind of our guide through this exploration of war and what it does to people and how they react to it in different ways.
Yeah. And Yvonne is definitely willing to die. You get that sense right off the bat almost. I get the sense that this kid is ready to go kill Nazis and, if need be, get killed by Nazis. He literally expresses that he is ready to sacrifice himself, or ready to do whatever it takes to kill Nazis, which is admirable. But at the same time, you question his decision, his priorities, especially when you can go to that line.
Yeah, he seems to be more in a reconnaissance role. To me, I don't think he was presented as a militant part of the operation.
Oh no,
he was never
certainly
armed.
the point of him was he was tiny, so he could get across the line easily and wade through water, because of course it's not a Tarkovsky film unless somebody is wading through water.
Yeah, there's a lot of water. And we could talk about one of the things that a lot of people have noticed and written about Tarkovsky is the way he uses textures to make his worlds feel very real. And obviously water is a great way to do that, because you have the different ways that water can be presented. And, wading through the water in this film is happens a lot, and it's also very beautiful the way that Tarkovsky uses his black and white film, because this film is in black and white again, and he uses black and white very specifically in other films, and we talked about that with Stalker, but this one is all black and white and is very dark at times, in a way that I haven't seen before. It's so almost completely underexposed, but it's so perfect, and it just feels perfectly like night. It doesn't feel like artificial night, although it had to have been, or at least day for night, but you really can't tell. It's one of the best kind of ways to show a really dark environment that I've seen.
Yeah, and that's super important because Tarkovsky is all about precision control of his image, and making sure it looks like how he wants it to look, to convey his overall. I don't want to say message because that's not true, but his overall idea of what the film is supposed to be. So he's well known for just stunning images, both because they're kind of like out there, like they're unconventional, which was an honest effort on his part, and two, because they're just good. They're just really good.
Yeah.
And Ivan's Childhood is just stock full of really, really good imagery, just all over the place. That's beautiful. Of course,
Whether
there's
it's
the famous
backlit dust with a cross silhouetted as bombs are exploding, or were you about to mention the one with all the jagged wood?
Yeah, that's the specific one that I really, really love. That all points to there are all these broken pieces of wood pointing to Ivan, which could say something. I don't want to say it does. Gosh, that's going to be a long argument, but we're going to save that. But yeah, and again, anything that can add texture, which I heard somebody describe as anything to do with the four elements, does a really good job of adding texture in a film, especially when it comes to Tarkovsky.
And he uses all of those.
And he uses all of them. So, there's a lot of mud, especially in this film. There's a lot of water in this film. There's constantly, because they're on this, so you're on a front, and people send up flares all the time to help to remind everybody, hey, this is where the front is. Don't cross this. And to light the way for patrols and other things like that. So there's constantly like flares falling in the background at exactly the right time, because that's how Tarkovsky does. And, Jonathan, did you know that, and this is not a film we're covering this week, but in the film The Sacrifice, which is another Andrei Tarkovsky film, the house that burns down in it is rigged to burn down in exactly 8 minutes.
Wow, that's impressive.
And it's shot in this super long take. And again, we're not covering that film specifically this week, but we are talking Tarkovsky.
And we will have structures burning a little bit later on.
Yeah, putting stuff on, setting stuff on fire, having stuff happen precisely a certain way, which again, that's another reason he gets compared to Kubrick sometimes, is that exact precision control of what your image is going to be, and this is what it is going to be, and my DP helps me execute that, but I am the one in charge of the image as the director.
And the long takes, the oneers, which we get some great ones in here, specifically the scene I've already mentioned of the older officer flirting with
Masha.
Flirting with Masha, the doctor's assistant. And it's just in this really long, must have been a steady cam kind of situation where we're following them and kind of the camera's moving between them and switching between framing one of them or both of them, and just letting that scene play out, and the extreme awkwardness where he's not being forcefully advancing on her, but it's still more than is comfortable. She's clearly not.
It's definitely uncomfortable
into him, and but having it all play out in one take, like we've talked about with many other directors who do one takes very well, it heightens that sense because you don't get a break from it. You're watching it happen for several minutes at a time without the luxury of switching images and giving you that breath.
Yeah, Tarkovsky basically waits to cut until he's gotten everything out of a shot they can possibly get. So he's not looking to make an effective cut so much as he's looking to make the most effective shot he can. And that's what it feels like. He lets the shot ride as much as he can before going to the new one. And it works. It works for his style. Which is unconventional. And if let's just look at story structure in this film for a minute. Our main character, and honestly, our protagonist, the guy who drives the action, is Ivan. And we spend the first 20 minutes of the film with him. and then we don't see him for like half an hour.
Yeah.
He's just gone while we're dealing with these two officers and their kind of like secret quarrel over Masha. And then Yvonne comes back out of nowhere and they go on this patrol. But he's just gone. He's just gone before he comes back for a long while. And I think we've mentioned the 3-act structure before, beginning, middle, end, essentially. Yeah. And Tarkovsky doesn't worry about that too much. There's a story happening here, but it doesn't happen beat for beat like you would expect like a hero's journey tale to.
Yeah, and I will say that out of the ones that we're going to talk about after this is probably the easiest to follow because it does kind of have a linear structure. But
linear-ish.
Yeah, he throws in a lot of memories, but he's very clear that they are memories.
But damn, does he slide them in very well.
Yeah, his transition between dreams and memories, because like you were saying, he has this, Yvonne has this kind of PTSD thing where he'll constantly be thinking about his mother while he's sleeping, and he's afraid that he's spoken in his sleep and kind of express that out loud. But the way he transitions, so for example, the very first time that we go into a dream, Yvonne has just gone to bed and we cut to his hand hanging off the bed and it's dripping with water and the water drips. And then we pan up into this looking up from inside of a well, and Yvonne and his mother are at the top and they're having this conversation about being able to see the stars in the well. And it's just like perfectly, like smoothly incorporated into the scene, almost in the way that we talked about 8.5 did, Fellini's 8.5 in Italy, where he would start with a character suddenly into a scene who was in the dream, and then that's kind of adding that element slowly transitions us in. And we know that Tarkovsky was hugely influenced by the European New Wave, so French New Wave, Italian Neorealism, all these things that we've talked about before. So he's drawing a lot of that, and you can see it in works, but it's just taking that influence and incorporating it into this film is just done perfectly. All right, but let's transition from probably the most grounded film this week to something that's way off the ground, as in space. And let's talk about Solaris from 1972. Alex, go for it.
I will try, Jonathan. And also, Solaris, the planet, has no ground. It is just an ocean.
Yeah.
Just a big old ocean. Now let's start there. There's this planet called Solaris. And we don't know much about it. We're not really given too much info about like its discovery or anything like that. So don't expect that backstory. This is just about a planet that seems to be a sentient ocean with some kind of life and some kind of weird power that we don't really understand. But it does have an effect on the scientists who live and work in a research station there. A research station designed to hold upwards of 80 people, but who only houses 3 now. And we have a psychiatrist on Earth who we start with, who is going to be sent to the station to evaluate whether or not the Solaristics program, the research program on Solaris, will continue. And this is a widower who goes up to Solaris with maybe one of the most interesting space travel scenes I've ever seen, because it's a rejection of doing space travel. But yeah, but we'll get to that. So once our main character, Chris Kelvin, the psychiatrist, is on the station, he finds that his one friend among the scientists has committed suicide, and the other 2 are near insane at this point.
They seem very unstable, yeah.
Yeah, kind of unhinged. Well, not kind of unhinged, just unhinged.
Also, there's weird things happening.
There are weird things happening, and those weird things is that the Solaris planet, ocean, sentient being, whatever, seems to be able to manifest neutrino-based life forms that resemble the memories of the people on board. And you can understand how that would be distressing. For instance, if your wife, who had at one point committed suicide, suddenly appears in your bedroom when you wake up in the middle of the night and she's sitting in a chair across the room, that might upset you a little bit. And
or so you just kiss her right away.
Or you just launch her off in a rocket out over the planet, which is what our main character does, and then a second version of the of his deceased wife, now not so deceased, or at least cloned, and her name, just for future reference, is Hari. And the second time she shows up, he decides to embrace her as his wife, or at least explore the possibilities of having her back in his life, and kind of the whole process of re-examining his past relationship with her, and anything he could do or take the blame with in the cause to her past suicide. And of course, the other two scientists aboard are struggling with the appearances of their own memories, who I don't think we really get to interact with much, but they all have
Yeah, we just see a little person run out of one of the rooms, and then you're just like, whoa, okay.
Yeah, what is happening? But they all kind of engage in this discussion of what to do about this planet. Should they stay here? Should they abandon it? Should they attack the ocean? Should they send it their brainwaves so that it knows to stop? Which, again, not really big on the whole science fiction here. The sciencey part of the science fiction, really just focusing on exploring the philosophical ramifications of human exploration into space, and kind of just examining what happened, or just large questions about humanity. To be honest with you, it's all very confusing to me still. I don't fully get it. With all Tarkovsky things, you kind of have to watch it like 20 times before you start to get it, but that's if there's really anything to get. I don't know. Jonathan, what do you think?
So if you listened to the Russia episode and heard our discussion on Stalker, you will know how much we stumbled over that description and that discussion, because probably we should not have started with his hardest film, but that's besides the point. So, because after Ivan's childhood, which again is pretty much straightforward, you're following this child, and plot developments happen very similarly to a normal film. But most of Tarkovsky's films are less straightforward than that, and you are presented with a lot of images and dialogue that you kind of have to sift through. But they also have to be taken at face value, because Tarkovsky is not one for symbolism, even though the way he crafts his very beautiful images lend themselves to be viewed as symbols very easily. But he's really more interested in just portraying truth. So the very beautiful shots of nature and of earth and things like that in this film are to be taken as that. They are to evoke a nostalgia and an appreciation for the earth. So it's just supposed to be seen as very beautiful images of earth, because his main focus with the movie is to present that. It's in, as opposed to 2001, which, like we said, was looking forward. It was looking to technological advancements and the dangers of that, and the next steps in the ways that humans are evolving and their interaction with technology. Solaris is set in a future that looks like modern day, and it's very much grounded in the present and on Earth, and it uses this sci-fi backdrop in order to present very modern and current human again, character development, and looking at Chris's relationship with his dead wife and his grief and mourning and that kind of thing, and also his relationship with his parents to some extent. And so another thing we could talk about is that this film was actually marketed as the Russian 2001, because 2001 had come out a couple years before this, although Tarkovsky had not seen it before he started working on it. But after he did see it, he literally told his crew, that's kind of the opposite of what I want to do. I don't like how cold and sterile that film is. And we even talked about how the human characters are very devoid of emotion, and they're almost stand-ins for humans. Tarkovsky wanted to be the other side of that and be very grounded and very human. in his film. But honestly, it's best to not even think about 2001 when you're watching the film. There are comparisons you can make. The eye shot whenever he's going through space and stuff like that. But it is very different and has its own life outside of that context.
Yeah, they aren't really the same kind of film. I mean, I even kind of have a hard time classifying Solaris as a sci-fi. Like, I guess,
And that's
the
what we said
setup
about
is
Stalker,
sci-fi.
too.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it literally does exactly what you're supposed to do with sci-fi, which is use the
Environment, world.
the environment of sci-fi, the environment of scientific progression or theoretical scientific progression to present some kind of ideological or philosophical question and then attempt to answer it. But again, like question and answer isn't really what Tarkovsky tries to do with his films. Like you said, he tries to present truth, or whatever he sees as the truth, or reality. I think might be the best way to describe it. And if you look at this film, it does a really good job of depicting the internal conflict of Chris Kelvin extremely well, which is again like, and I mentioned this in Ivan's Childhood, and that is like the entirety of the mirror. When we get to it, Tarkovsky is incredibly well at diving into complex human emotions that are hard to vocalize in just words, and use the tool making of cinema, of images over time and movement and color and sound, to really just create and depict and convey how internally conflicted one person can be. All of these issues that are coming up for Chris Kelvin, which are not easy issues. Like, he does, like, if you, from a writing standpoint, like, in terms of being mean to your characters to generate conflict, to generate interest, like, Solaris does a great job.
Yeah, forcing you to come to terms with your dead wife who committed suicide after your divorce with your own chemicals. Like, that is pretty rough.
That's deep stuff, man. That's deep stuff. It is not easy to address. And as to whether or not, like, could this story have been done on the ground in kind of like, and by ground I mean Earth, in kind of more of a mystical sense rather than in a space station on another planet in a scientific sense? Yeah, it could have. But this was also based on a book.
Right.
This is based on an established book.
The adaptation question comes back in.
And the adaptation question comes back in. And again, like, I think we might have mentioned it a little bit beforehand, but this is coming off of Andrei Rublev. Man, I cannot pronounce any names today. I'm sorry, guys. I love Russian names. I just cannot say them for the life of me.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've been out of the country, so.
Yeah. Just go my weekly jaunt to Russia. I'm kidding. I don't do that. But yeah, this is coming off of Andrei Rublev, which, by the way, I love as a film. It's one of my favorite Tarkovsky's films, because it's so weird and it's a period piece. I'm a sucker for period pieces, but it's just not financially successful. And it's the Russian government doesn't like it a lot either, and so they kind of kick it around a bit and pull it out of theaters maybe a bit too early, and by that I mean definitely too early. And so Tarkovsky is in big need of it, and the thing he can get by with Mosfilm is, hey, let's adapt this sci-fi film. Like you just said, 2001 can come out. This is the middle of the space race still in 1972, even though America had already gotten to the moon. The Russians were still trying. So sci-fi was still all the rage. This is Buzz Lightyear over Woody time still. So this seemed like a guaranteed cash cow. So even though Tarkovsky is such an independent filmmaker, like, he is still in ways constrained by his environment, which I find interesting. And he definitely made this as much his own as he could have. He pissed off the author of the book in the process, but he is still restricted to what he can do in the circumstances that allow him and facilitate the filmmaking that he wants to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I watched several of the kind of behind the scenes features on in the Criterion edition of this film, and it's interesting hearing that conversation because there was actually Tarkovsky had wanted, because he's so like not comfortable with science fiction, which is why neither of the two science fiction films he made feel like science fiction at all, especially Stalker. But he wanted the film to take place 2/3 of it on Earth. But Stanislav, I don't know how to use W's in those languages, but he was like, no, you can't deviate that far. You've gone far enough, and so he had to keep it mostly in space. But even in space, he throws in so many flashbacks and again those dream sequences that are on Earth and that convey this beauty of Earth, that he still gets away with it. And then again, like we were talking about with the comparison to 2001, where Tarkovsky was like, I don't want our spaceship to look, or our space station to look like this pristine white utopia, space utopia, like the beautiful shots in 2001 were. And literally, I think the way he described it to his art director was, I want ours to look like a broken down bus. And so it kind of does. It has these round windows every so often in the thing, and it's got pieces falling off everywhere, and it's got all these panels and stuff on the side with little blinking lights and whatever. And again, the texture is just great. And the library, can we talk about the library? Because the library is amazing.
The library is really pretty. It looks like it's
doesn't
on
even
Earth.
feel like the same place. Right. It feels like a college library or something. Or like a little study room.
Yeah, it's completely gorgeous, especially when stuff starts floating in it, which
or someone has smoke coming backlit above their head. Oh my gosh, I love that shot. Right.
Which I would say the floating is very sci-fi, except that just happens in some of Tarkovsky's films. Like, it just happens. I know for sure it happens in... The
Mirror.
It does happen in The Mirror. It also happens in Nostalgia and The Sacrifice. So it happens in a lot of his films. But a commentary on on the whole broken down bus thing. But I thought it was funny when we walk into Chris Kelvin's room for the first time on the space station, and it's clean.
Yeah,
and
it is.
It's clean and I had the thought when we walked in there, I was like, oh, this is going to be messed up by the end of the film. This is going to be cracked, and there's going to be texture all over the place.
Plants
and shawls just kind of left about.
Yeah.
I think 3 in total.
I think 1 was in the library.
Oh, right. There is 1 in the library. Anyway, but yeah, that is exactly what happens. And I also find it very interesting that the way Tarkovsky prefers to present both physical locations and characters and the internal life of characters is fundamentally broken down. Everything you see, like if you go back to our Stalker episode, everything you see is run down and broken. And the people you meet are broken. And 2 things about that. 1, it's more interesting. Like, having conflicted characters is interesting. Having all that texture on screen. And in the sound design, by the way, I feel like we should come back to that at some point.
Yeah.
Is very interesting and very visceral. And 2, Tarkovsky's thing is depicting realism. Like, that's his jam, and that's how he sees the world. And I don't think he's entirely wrong in that, in seeing the world that way. Trust me, I've been in the New York subway system. It kind of looks like that. Is that New York burn? Kind of is, but it's earned. I don't think anyone will disagree with me on that. And also, like, people, like, it's hard to live past a certain age and not be kind of broken inside. To some, or have flaws or have conflictions. I don't want to make it sound too depressing. Like, I don't think it is a really depressing thing. I think it's just the reality. Or even if you just look at Ivan, I mean, if Ivan, he's young and he's conflicted and broken up inside.
Yeah, and going off of that, I mean, we should mention that without spoiling the film, it's not a happy-go-lucky ending. It's not like the most depressing ending ever, but it's very kind of conflicted and not necessarily a happy ending or optimistic ending, I guess you could say. It's kind of a trap of circular mistakes and stuff like that. Because the film kind of revolves a lot around second chances and what you do with that. And, you know, if you could have done it differently, wouldn't you have done it that way in the first place? And like, there's so much that goes into it that you really come away with it. And with all of these films, like, again, with Stalker, where we were so messed up by the end, we were like, you have to just take time to ingest it and think about it because he packs a lot in there just through the presentation and also the dialogue and the discussion. And that's another thing we could talk about. We were talking about a little bit before we started recording is the kind of contrast between the way that Tarkovsky likes to present things visually, so visually without using words. And then also he has just like very heavy philosophical dialogue sections as well. And he was like hugely influenced by obviously Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, the great Russian authors, and they deal with philosophical things through the medium of words. And so that leaks into Tarkovsky's work as well. And then mixing that with the visuals. So he he has the visuals and the dialogue that both are presenting things and feeding off of one another in a way that conveys the meaning without using symbolism. I think that's what I'm getting at, is that this is how he circumnavigates the use of symbolism that can be weeded through and interpreted in a way that he doesn't want, I guess. And so he uses dialogue in place of that in one way.
Yeah. And it's definitely not, it's not what we're used to. Like that's not what we're used to in most art. That's not what we're used to in basically any other film that isn't made by Tarkovsky, because he's so unique. Maybe some experimental film, but a lot of that feeds in or fed out of Tarkovsky. But you know, it's an adjustment to make as
a viewer,
like to experience a medium that isn't functioning how you expect that medium to function. And you know, my best advice for that is to just clear your mind. Don't worry about it. Just watch it.
Take it as it is, as it's presented to you. That's Tarkovsky's goal, is for people to watch it as it is, because he's putting what he wants on screen, and he's not trying to get you to go all deep with it. He's like, just watch it for what it is, and then just let it resonate with you from that.
Yeah, you're not gonna have a big idea or a big epiphany while the credits roll in this film. You're gonna have a big or deep idea or epiphany 2 weeks after watching this film, not even because of anything in the film, but because the film broadened your mind by presenting a unique view on the universe that you didn't have before. That wasn't trying to preach you anything, but was just trying to give you a pure, raw, weird human experience as it possibly could.
Yeah. And one more thing I want to mention about the cinematography before we move on is the use of black and white, because it's even unique amongst Tarkovsky films in this one, because there are sections that are black and white, but they kind of alternate. There's never true black and white. It alternates between a very warm orange kind of sepia feel and a very cool, almost violet tinted black and white. And they're used like in very different ways. Often the blue is on Earth and the warm oranges are on Solaris. And but again, with Tarkovsky, he doesn't use black and white in a way that is like, you know, I think we talked about with Stalker, whereas like sometimes it was black and white outside of the zone. It was mostly this sepia outside of the zone and color inside of the zone. But that wasn't even strictly true. And so there's never like black and white is only for memories, or it's only for Earth, or it's only for Solaris or whatever. He uses it just as if he feels it needs to be. And there's also a little bit of a logistical reason. In one of the interviews, I think the art director was talking about how there would be shortages of color film in Russia, which apparently shortages of film is a problem Russia has had since the beginning. But sometimes they would just give Tarkovsky black and white film, and so he would have to find a way to justify that in the film. And he makes such beautiful black and white images that really he doesn't need to justify it at all. He just needs to do it. But it's just interesting in a way that can't really be described, but just experienced, to see the ways in which he uses it and when he does it, and how he adds color to the black and white in this film specifically to convey feelings.
Yeah. And the appropriate reaction to the swap between color and black and white is kind of just go, huh, cool. Not, what does it mean?
Right. Which is a hard switch if you're not expecting it.
Yeah, I mean, hell, we spent the last 39 episodes going, what does it mean? And trying to figure out how to reverse engineer that to make better films in our own right. But Tarkovsky doesn't do that. Tarkovsky just does Tarkovsky. And speaking of someone else trying to do Tarkovsky, what about the remake of this film, Jonathan? What's the story behind that?
Yes, so in, I believe it was 2002, this film was remade. Not the book, it was actually Tarkovsky's version, because like we said, they're very different. But the film was remade in America, starring George Clooney and I forget who else, which neither of us have seen. There is a great video essay that I'll include a link to that kind of breaks down the differences, but it kind of was an attempt to make it more accessible and more commercially viable. From the trailer, it looks like they play up some of the frightening elements, which this film is not frightening at all, but you could turn the idea of, memories materializing into something more thriller-like, I suppose. But yeah, this just it's an example of taking an auteur's work and adapting it to something that it's not, and then having it completely fail because we have not heard of it. Maybe it didn't completely fail, that might be too harsh, but it's definitely does not live up to the legendary status that Solaris itself has, the Tarkovsky version.
Yeah, when film nerds think of Solaris, because I guarantee you they're the only ones who think of Solaris, they're thinking of the Tarkovsky one, not the Soderbergh one. And so on to our last film of the day, The Mirror, the most unconventionally structured of all of them, but maybe the most interesting experience to watch, from 1975. And Jonathan, give it your best shot.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of set up the overarching setup of The Mirror. The Mirror is basically, but not exclusively, a series of vignettes of different things and interactions between people, all kind of flowing together with this voiceover of poetry, which is actually poems written by Arseny Tarkovsky, Andrei Tarkovsky's father, and loosely following our quote-unquote protagonist, who is never seen on screen, which is Andrei Tarkovsky himself, is very autobiographical, but also kind of loosely autobiographical. He's actually in the film. It's definitely character interactions that mirror his own life. And he said of the film that every single slice or event that happens in the film is something that has happened to someone close to him that he knows of. So again, it's this conveying truth. Some of these things seem very abstract and symbolic again, but he literally says, why are people so confused with this film? I presented things as they happened. And so that is kind of how it goes, and you have to just take it as it is. Otherwise, you will blow your brain up trying to figure out what it means. Also, yeah, lots of archival footage of war because he lived through the war at a young age, and yeah, so there's vignettes of war training. There's vignettes of relationship troubles. There's a vignette of a barn burning down, which may or may not have been his fault. I think it kind of implies at the end. And just a woman selling her earrings and things like this. It's so much is packed into this film, and it's less than 2 hours long. And that's another thing we were talking about before, is it's still his style of very long takes and very again, here's the word, trance-like style. But there's so much there. There's so much there that I haven't totally wrapped my mind around it yet. So I'm just giving a very broad overview.
Oh yeah. I have no idea. I can't help you. I'm sorry.
It's beautiful and it's wonderful, but it's tricky and it's very personal to Tarkovsky. So it's hard to just kind of step into that. And it's definitely one that at the end you're just like, wow, okay,
yeah,
that'll be on my mind for a long time.
Yeah, and I definitely think that his films, and especially a film like this, is supposed to be an experience to watch. Mm-hmm. And then you have shared that experience with Tarkovsky, and I think he's hoping to impart part of his world view or view of the world onto you through that, but not like any kind of specific, symbolic, or ideological way. Just kind of like his view of reality transferred into film for you to also absorb. But I can also see that temptation here, and especially in The Mirror, where you can submit to kind of like almost like a sandbox theory. And I think one of the and by sandbox theory I mean like there's all these symbols and weird connections for you to make, and all these weird juxtapositions, which of course, like, Tarkovsky specifically refuted montage, which is kind of a specific refutation of juxtaposition through editing to create meaning. But, there's all these elements here that could be easily interpreted to mean so many different things. And it could easily be interpreted as this movie is a sandbox for you to draw your own meaning from. And it's even easier to get to that point because Tarkovsky is so precise. Precise. Like we talked about with Kubrick last week, like, he does everything for a reason. That's why he does like a billion takes of a shot, is for a reason. He wants the exact framing on a Steadicam that he wants, or he wants the exact center punch with the eyes exactly on the center punch, or the exact performance from an actor. And when you see that kind of obsessiveness from a director, you assume that that specific choice has meaning, and meaning in the way we traditionally associate meaning with storytelling and communication through film. But with Tarkovsky, it's just for Tarkovsky's own motivations, and it's just, I want it there because I want it there because that's how it happened. That's real life. Yeah. Or his view of real life.
And the influence on Tarkovsky that we can probably most specifically bring into The Mirror is his love of Japanese art and Japanese poetry, specifically the haiku, because Japan had created the haiku, which is basically an art form of saying something that is and using a very precise poetic format to state a simple truth in a beautiful way. And so that is something that is a good point of reference if you're trying to think about Tarkovsky's films, is that he's trying to present a truth plainly on its face in a very beautiful way. It's just when you make it very visual and you add elements that are often used as symbols, it gets very hard to turn the connection making part of your brain off.
Because we're human. We look for patterns.
Yeah.
That is like by default what we do.
Although thankfully, I don't think that there's a series of conspiracy theories about this film.
I still think he's saying that Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing.
It's very possible.
The structure of this film is just way out there. It's way out there. I think it feels more way out there than it really is, because it's, again, more or less, I think the best thing of any Tarkovsky film is the character portrait that you get over the course of the film. And if you look at this film that way, then this is the exploration of one main character, who in the present time is a 40-year-old man who is, I believe, dying of some sickness, and he's divorced from his wife. But we also flash back to different points in his life and in his mother's life too. Like his mother's kind of like the second main character of the entire film. But the way in which you move between these different times is almost like they're almost all happening at once. Like it's not like you cut to title card and then like year 1965 or anything like that. You move on into the next one almost like you're in the exact same room.
Yeah, and sometimes there'll be like archival war footage cut in there, which kind of helps give a time switch, and sometimes we'll switch to black and white footage, which will be used for a short amount of time just to get us into the next place, and then we'll cut back to color while we're still in a certain time setting. But yeah, it's really hard to describe because, again, he doesn't use any one technique enough to let you categorize it. As we've talked about with like everything that he does, he uses it as it feels right, but not in a way that it can be taken as meaning something other than the way that it is presented to you.
Yeah. And again, like if you look at it, it's very clearly Tarkovsky. Sometimes you'd be troubled to give the details as to why it's so Tarkovsky, but it is Tarkovsky. And one of the scenarios where it is easier to give details is where we're transitioning through time with the mother, and she's washing her hair, and as she moves up very slowly, I believe it's in slow motion, the entire house like fills up with water as it crashes through the ceiling, and again like the house breaks and decays, and like that decayed plaster look that Tarkovsky loves so much. Like somebody, I don't even know how plaster or paint or drywall gets to look like that unless Tarkovsky's art crew just comes through like a plague of locusts with chippers and chip it off. I'm just going to assume that's what it was if I ever see a decayed wall in the future. It was Tarkovsky's art crew, the ones that were affected by the plant on Stalker and instead of dying became immortal and now roam the world chipping paint. Man, that would be a cool comic. Note that. But anyway, they transition through this odd near dream sequence where the house collapses and we move into the next scenario through the collapsed, decayed house. But one thing I want to point out during that transition is the textuality of the sounds and the sound design, because I think I mentioned it a little bit before and said I would talk about it later. But seriously, for a hallmark of Tarkovsky films is just like the guttural nature, the gut clenching nature of the sounds. It feels like the entire thing was done in post. I have a hard time believing any production sound was used. All the voices sound so crisp, like ADR level crisp, and all of the sounds are precisely placed for one, and B, like amped up to like, and it may 11.
Be there may be a kind of balance between the logistics of filming on whatever budget he had in Russia, But also, yeah, there's definitely, at least with the non-diegetical sounds, the score and stuff like that, it is just as textured as his visuals, very ambient and soundscapes that don't have distinctive themes in them unless he's using classical music, which he does like to do a lot.
Yeah.
But the custom things are very just, they evoke a feeling rather than a distinguishable pattern of music or something like that.
Yeah. And it wouldn't be the first time that we see logistical issues lead to a director trademark. Like, that happens all the time.
Right.
Or at least just really good creative choices. Like, that is, I mean, that, again, if we've learned one thing from the filmlings, it's that constraint generates fantastic creative choices when it works well. And when it doesn't work well, then you're just screwed. But we talk about the situations where it works well here on the filmlings. And all of these films were created under very difficult circumstances for what they were, for a market that wasn't really looking. I'm willing to say a market that wasn't really looking for this kind of fare at the moment. This
and that's why he made these films.
Yeah, this non-symbolic, non. I almost want to say non-explicit, but it kind of is explicit because there's nothing to imply. It just is.
Yeah, and to talk about that, we can kind of talk about in overall a little bit more, which we may have to transition into soon. But just this idea that he's working in Soviet Russia, which is a very, it's obviously a communist and predominantly, and I don't know how explicitly atheist it was, but his films are so inundated with spiritual themes, even if it's not explicit because of censorship and stuff. It is definitely saturated in there. This search for a higher meaning and stuff like that. That, like you're saying, his films weren't very commercially viable, and they were often censored on top of that. But he made them because he felt like they needed to be made. In fact, in one of his diary entries, which we've been kind of alluding to without mentioning, but we're pulling several ideas from his actual diary, which was published after his death and after the KGB released parts of his diary at a time because it had been confiscated. Because go figure, KGB. But his diary is published in English as Time Within Time. And so I'll include a link to that because there's actually a PDF version online. But he talks about how one of the quotes from his diary is, he says, "Anyone who does not aspire to greatness of soul is worthless, as insignificant as a field mouse or a fox." And so he had very strong feelings about art and the way that art and film should be used. And he was definitely trying to convey something higher and something more than just cold, nihilistic, atheistic principles through his films, which made it very tricky for him to get his films made and eventually led to his quote-unquote exile. So it's very interesting to see how he does that. It's almost like we talked about with the Hays Code, where he's trying to toe that line between, on the censorship issue, of how spiritual can he make his films without getting them barred.
How subversive can he be under the current regime?
Right, exactly. And he did it as blatantly as he could, and now in posterity his films are viewed as masterpieces because he did it his own way, as Sinatra would say.
Oh my gosh, are you gonna burst out singing? Please do.
Not yet, but we got to get some Sinatra on the podcast at some point.
Oh gosh, yeah, he'll wander his way in when he's good and ready to. He'll wander
break some kneecaps to get in.
Yeah. So we're kind of already there, but let's just say this is overall notes now. And talking about Tarkovsky as a whole, which we've kind of been doing the whole podcast because it's hard not to. But Tarkovsky as a filmmaker presents, he is the filmmaker's filmmaker. He is the guy who everybody on Criterion absolutely loves. Probably just short of Kurosawa, but those two are in kind of a class together. They were kind of almost buddies, I think.
Yeah, they
correct me if
did
I'm wrong.
interact. I think there's an anecdote in the Solaris Criterion article, or in the booklet anyway, that has an essay written by Akira Kurosawa where he actually visited the set of Solaris, and afterwards they went out and Tarkovsky got drunk, which he didn't usually drink, but he was drunk on this occasion, and stood up and started singing the theme to Seven Samurai at the top of his lungs, and Kurosawa just ate it up and loved it. And then also there was another anecdote about Kurosawa. He was there when they were filming Solaris, and he asked for an hour alone in the space station set, and he just wandered around it alone for an hour, and he came out with lots of notes scribbled down in Japanese, and he said, I want to make a movie here in Russia. And so that's
Is that how he made Dursa Uzla?
I think that was it. Yeah. So
I love Dursa Uzla. That is a good film.
And the other connection between Solaris and Japan is that there's a quite memorable, actually, very long scene of driving where we're just seeing these lights go past, and they're in this, again, that blue tinted black and white, and then it transitions to color, and we're seeing busy streets and stuff. That's all actually filmed in Japan, in Tokyo and somewhere else, I forget. But getting approval to film out of the country or to go out of the country was very difficult, so Tarkovsky left a lot of these really long driving sequences, which are his MO, granted, in the film because he wanted to visit Japan, because again, he has such an affinity for Japanese culture.
Let me shoot this huge scene so I can go visit my buddy.
Exactly. Basically, that's what you have to do in a communist state, apparently.
Which I guess that was the reality of life. So if that's what's being portrayed in the film, if you're talking about reality of life, I mean, being stuck in a car, just driving down a highway forever, it's
Skyping people.
Yeah. Who does that? Who Skypes?
Apparently, everyone since Metropolis in, what was that, 1925?
Yeah. It was. Wow, it's been a while. Yeah, and so I will say right off the bat, because Tarkovsky does his own thing that is all about the atmosphere of reality, the atmosphere of truth that he creates, and the emotions of his characters. It's really interesting for me to watch, but he's not a filmmaker who I look at and I'm like, I want to do what that guy does. And possibly just because that's Tarkovsky and that's what Tarkovsky does. And I don't, that is for him to do, and he did it so well. I don't think almost anybody else could come close to it.
Yeah, it's almost something that, you could take inspiration from, but no one is going to be able to do it quite the way that Tarkovsky did and convey the same depth with such simplicity of images and such just beauty presented on its face. And maybe you have to be the son of a famous poet to just kind of grow up with that infused in you and in your artistic sensibilities, but he's definitely unparalleled in the area and the type of work that he tried to create. And another thing that, now that we're talking about overall notes, we can talk about kind of his view of cinema in general, because he had very strong feelings. He wasn't a very forceful person. That's another thing we should say, especially talking about the Solaris adaptation, is that he's not a forceful person. He has very strong opinions about film because he kind of had to, as such a passionate filmmaker, but he wasn't one to kind of force his way onto anyone, except in the realm of film where he needed to get what he wanted on film. But it's interesting because he was so against commercial filmmaking, and he despised the idea of blockbusters and anything that was just made for the sake of an audience liking it. He was just categorically against that idea, and made films the way that he wanted to make them, regardless of whether the audience had a positive reaction to them or not. And it's actually funny, there's there's a famous exemption to this that he actually expressed some admiration for the film Terminator, which he liked. I think he liked the ideas that were presented in the film, even though he said that the acting and the filmmaking were subpar. But even so, he still liked the idea of the movie, which is kind of interesting.
Oh gosh, I can only imagine what he would have done with Terminator. Which,
That would be interesting.
let me say right now, he wouldn't do it.
Yeah, he would not have done it. But it's interesting to think about, kind of his heightened expectations of film as an art form, because that's what he saw it as. He saw it as art and not as entertainment. It was definitely for him a way to convey big meanings with beauty and depth, and not a way to just kind of escape from real life for a couple hours and eat some popcorn. But considering the difference of setting that he was creating films in versus the setting that blockbusters emerged out of in the American New Wave, it's interesting because, again, there's so much censorship in the communist environment, and he's trying to convey very spiritual themes, which is something that is so frowned upon and so
Threatening to the state. That's the root of it. It's a threatening to the state. It is a separate power source other than the people's the Soviet Party. So that's why they didn't want it around. You don't want another power base available. Right,
but Tarkovsky saw that mankind needs to reach for something beyond itself, and so he had to just, by his own nature and values, infuse that into his films. And since that's the same thing that the state didn't want, he felt that the art and the cinema had an obligation to put that in their films. Whereas you see in America, there was such an inundation of films and such freedom of content. We have the Hays Code and all that stuff, but compared to a communist state, there is so much more that the American film market could do. And so we had the luxury of having popcorn movies and entertainment movies, along with the deeper films that have been being made since films began. So, he had very strong feelings, but it's also interesting to just see where those are coming from and how one's just environment of creating art changes one's perspective of that art and standards for that art.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how kind of just in totality ignoring audience expectations, he invented his own thing, his own rhythm, his own drum beat to dance to, his own cinematic language that was in ways built off of the one before. But all those rules of like a close-up means this, if you cut from this to this it means this, this camera movement means this, he just kind of threw that out and was like, here you go, this is it. And it worked, which is fascinating. And it kind of gives hope and gives a start of a potential frontiers for the cinematic rhetoric that we know and have studied to grow more than we would expect it to. Okay, Jonathan. So the poll is finally over. The tie
literally as we were recording.
Broken. Yes. So what are we going to talk about next week, Jonathan?
Well, it was a close call, but by one vote, the Bourne trilogy has won the poll for which action series we're going to cover. So next week, we're taking a break from the philosophical and get into some popcorn films, but popcorn films with great character development and great action. So we'll be talking about, if you don't know, The Bourne Identity from 2002, The Bourne Supremacy from 2004, and The Bourne Ultimatum from 2007. Not The Bourne Legacy, but bonus watching, I guess. I don't even know if we'll mention
Yeah.
it next week.
Or the other Bourne movie.
Oh yeah, there was another one. I totally.
It's just called. I think it's just called Jason Bourne.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of series seem to have zombie syndrome these days. You keep killing it and it keeps coming back. But
Yeah.
we're just going to be talking about the prime of the Bourne series, the Bourne trilogy.
Which, spoiler alert, we both love the trilogy, so it might be a lot of gushing next week. But we're gonna try and
Watched
dig
it
deep.
so many times.
We're gonna dig deep and get into just why we love these movies so much.
Yeah, we're going to establish our supremacy over them. Anyway,
Just don't. We're given an ultimatum to find our identity.
trying to identify your pun there. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
Hey,
Oh, is it done?
it's done. Jason
Did it tie?
Bourne won.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. This has been the most crazy pull.